hear that it's going to be another standing room only night in the Flynn space. And I applaud the Burlington audience for their taste because I've been looking, this is one of the concerts I've really been looking forward to. Helen Sung is our guest. Welcome her, please.
Thank you, Bob.
Helen is someone I met, I don't know, must be 10 or 15 years ago, a while ago.
Closer to 15,
okay.
Fortunately.
Somewhere in there, somewhere in there. And I'll just say, when I met Helen, she was in the first class of the Thelonious Monk Institute for Jazz Performance. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I know, Helen's music for a while, and I've enjoyed her CDs and what have you, but in preparing for interviews, of course, you go and you do research, and you want to make sure you have an overview of the person you're speaking to. And I was shocked, maybe I knew this and forgot it, to read that you came to playing jazz fairly late. And talk about that and about the specific circumstance that kind of turned you into a jazz person.
I always tell people who ask me, God must have wanted me to be a jazz musician, because it's nothing I would have ever thought of on my own to choose. I'll probably say this again later tonight. I'm the child of immigrant parents, born in China, raised in Taiwan. My dad did graduate schooling in the States, and that's how I came to be born here, and that meant I was supposed to be a doctor or, some sort of
professional,
honorable profession in the Asian community. But somehow my mom, I don't remember this. I remember having a little toy piano when I was little, but she said she heard me playing melodies I heard off of the TV and radio. So they didn't have any grand designs. I think it was just something to keep me occupied. But when I felt a connection to music, I was a classical pianist and violinist, actually. And I was trained by a very strict Russian teacher from the Russian school. And so I was discouraged from listening to the radio, although I did sneak in, a little bit of Madonna and Michael Jackson and stuff like that in high school. But I went to UT for my undergrad in classical piano. I was there. A friend of mine invited me to hear Harry Connick Jr. And, I was your typical classical pianist in the practice room all the time. I never went to one single football game. Isn't that sad? Because the stadium was right by the music building. You could hear the roars on the weekends. So, I wasn't sure who he was, but she said, oh, no, you're going to love him. He's so cute and entertaining. I said, okay. So we went, and he had his big band with him, and it's so funny because I've done some playing with Ben Wolf, a bassist. I was there that night, and so was Russell Malone. I didn't know them, and but the big band was entertaining. His singing, of course, was fun too. But in the middle of the concert, he sat down and played some solo piano pieces. I remember wanting to jump out of my skin because I said, God, what is he doing? It was so alive. It was so visceral. It seemed like so much fun. Not that classical wasn't fun, but this was different. And I remember thinking, God, I feel like he's breaking all the rules I've been told to follow so carefully on my life. And so I and some of my classical friends, we enrolled in an intro to jazz piano. I felt kind of sorry for the teacher that semester.
Because you were really starting from ground zero?
Oh, really? Yeah, ground zero. But I think the difference was when the class was over, my friends were, that was fun. But I said, you know what, there's something about this music. And I went to the library and just checked out anything I could find to read about it. I had no guide. I was just basically, listening to anything. From Anthony Braxton to Billie Holiday to Fats Waller, Bill Evans, just whatever I could find. And I begged the jazz professor there for lessons. It took him a while, but he relented. But what I'm so fortunate to have gotten the opportunity to do is the Monk Institute.
Well, see, there are a few things about this that amaze me. First of all, I mean, you had it together when I first heard you.
So no, I didn't.
Well, no, I know you're going to say that, but I mean, this was the first year that, describe that program and what the idea is. It's basically an ensemble where one musician on each instrument is selected, right?
Well, it was it still is, it's still going on, and it's such an amazing experience. I think at this point jazz was still, it's different now, but it was still an uneasy relationship, I think, for jazz education at the university level. I think a lot of schools weren't offering majors in certain things, and so the Monk Institute, their vision for this program is they wanted it housed at a university or conservatory setting with all the benefits that that kind of environment offered, but the heart of the program revolved around the jazz masters who would come and work directly with the students for weeks at a time. Our first artist was Clark Terry, and I think the second one was Wynton Marsalis, and then Jimmy Heath. And I remember.
And wasn't Ron Carter kind of
Oh, he
one
was
of
the
the
artistic
directors?
director. Yeah, he was.
And I remember hearing you play with Curtis Fuller, I think was
Curtis
his name?
Fuller, yeah, Bobby Watson. It's just, you name it.
So now, how many years was that point where you entered that program from when you heard Harry Connick? Because it couldn't have
I
been
don't want
that
to
many
say
years.
it's so embarrassing because I really, when I get impatient, I say, oh, if I only knew back then what I knew now. But I have to be forced to admit, I think things happen usually when they're supposed to, because I think if I knew back then what I knew now, I'd be totally paralyzed, because I was so new to music, 3 years.
But I mean, you had obviously come quite a distance in the 2 or 3 years to even get into the program. So were you just doing it? Did you sleep in those 2 or 3 years? I mean, this is amazing. If you had heard Helen as, the first year student in the Monk program, you'd say, boy, she's really a good piano player. She's got a great future. And that's, she's only been doing this for 2 years. You'd say, unbelievable. So what were those 2 or 3 years like?
Well, like I said, I listened to everything I could do, and I was lucky because at UT at that point, the jazz program was still very young, so they didn't have many students, so I was doing things I wasn't ready to do, like playing in the jazz orchestra, which is their version of the big band, and in small combos. And they have a wonderful music program there. The classical department's amazing, but the jazz program is wonderful too, and they brought in a lot of great artists, people like Kenny Wheeler and Charlie Hayden. I remember those two, Red Rodney with Chris Potter. So I was exposed to a lot of good music, but I had to work my behind off. I did, and I have to continue to do that.
Well, and the other thing, now knowing all this that amazes me is you had obviously made a commitment to be a musician already.
Yes.
And you had made a commitment to another type of music that demands a lot out of the individual. So it must have been tough to make the switch, or were you dissatisfied when you heard Harry Connick? Do you think there was a seed?
Yeah, there was a secret dissatisfaction, I would say, that I was not even ready to really admit to myself fully. I remember thinking, because there was a good friend of mine who took from the same teacher from the Russian school. She was a year older than me at UT also. And I remember thinking one day, I feel like my life is already kind of mapped out, and I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it. I was just following what she was doing, taking the same classes. And I remember when I diverged from her, because there was a stage in the curriculum where you either took orchestration or counterpoint. And nobody wanted to take counterpoint because they said it's such a hard class, and it's just not worth the effort. And everybody took orchestration, and I don't know, I had a perverse fit, and I said, I want to take counterpoint. And I'm so glad I did, because, as a classical musician growing up, you're not encouraged to write music, compose, or improvise, but we had to do all of those things in that class, and it also taught me about the way music, at least, the Western classical harmony, the way music is put together, and that has been invaluable in how, learning how to improvise. So I think it's really started from there.
Okay. Now I also learned that you attended the Performing and Visual Arts High School in Houston, which is a place, I've been there, and after your time, but it's in what some might call a rough neighborhood, and it's not the newest building. And at the time I went in, and there's a Bosendorfer grand piano in there that someone had given the school, but it's the kind of place that has that level of support for the creative arts and has produced other musicians who are well known to everyone here, like Jason Moran and Eric Harlan and
Robert Glasper, Kendrick Scott, Chris Dave. Jamire Williams, Alan Hampton,
So,
Walter Smith III.
so I mean, some of these people were there when you were there, right?
Yeah, Chris
But you,
Dave and Jason Moran. He was starting there when I was in my last year.
okay.
But it's such a shame, you know. Well, you know what? I can't beat myself up for that because we were like right across the hall from each other. But I never had any interaction with any of the jazz program. I was just, you know, blinders on in a way. So I was so excited when in 2011 I finally played my first HSPVA jazz concert as a guest. It was so much fun, and a lot of the credit goes to Bob Morgan, Robert Morgan, trumpet player, great educator. He really built that program up, and he said, "Okay, Helen, we adopt you. You're one of my alumni now."
Well, you talked about the experience in the Monk program, and you know, among other, you mentioned some of the people you interacted with, but I remember, you know, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter. I mean, you've really been exposed to an incredible array of people, and I wonder if any particular exchanges or encounters stick out in your mind when you look back as, oh, this was really something I used that I learned here.
Well, just being in the presence of someone like Wayne Shorter leaves an indelible mark on you, I think. He's one of my favorite writers, and his whole concept, his whole approach to music and life is so unique, so profound, so honest and authentic. So that is a real inspiration for me. Herbie also, I remember seeing Herbie, I was like, wow, so this is how Herbie looks in person. You know, I've only seen him in pictures, right, in 3D. And we had a funny experience because I first met him because we did a student tour that Herbie and Wayne came on of India. And we took a day, they planned a day for us to go to the Taj Mahal. And we were taking a picture with the Taj Mahal behind us, but we were standing near to this ledge, and Herbie somehow missed a step and fell. And he caught himself, but he had a cut above his eye, and he started bleeding. And I remember we all freaked out. We were like, Herbie Hancock bleeds, and it was just like. So I don't know if I used that experience, but that was just like he became a human being to me at that point, because he's one of the timeless masters and icons of just all art in general. Two other, they were all so special, but one person who, well, I'll just name a few. Barry Harris, so fantastic. He really set me straight on just bebop and how foundational that is, and I worked so hard on that because I knew that I could kind of fake all the other styles to a certain extent, but bebop, I just said, man, I sound bad. Why did that? I mean, it's because it's such an exacting language. There really doesn't leave you much room for error, and he really helped me. I think I'll be chasing bebop forever, right? But he helped me start on the right path, let's put it that way. And John Faddis, I was a little afraid of him because I heard how his humor could be a little ruthless. But I think by the time he came to us, he had softened up enough so that he was fantastic. I remember he said to me, Helen, you need to learn more about the blues. So he made me learn this Ray Bryant solo on After Hours. And for years after, he would, whenever I saw him, all right, Helen, if there was a piano on your right, play that solo. I'm so
from the
After Hours, from the Sunny Side Up.
album?
The record with Sonny Stitt and
and Sonny Rollins
yes,
and Dizzy.
yes,
Okay,
that
okay,
one.
yeah.
And Kenny Barron, I took a couple of lessons with him. Such a model of elegance and taste and sophistication and just beauty. And of course, Ron Carter, he really kicked our behinds for 2 years. It was really remarkable experience. I hope I never take that for granted, because sometimes, since you went through it, oh, yeah, but, when you sit down and think about it, it's like, oh, my goodness. And one thing he did that he made us do that I truly benefited from, he said, you want to develop your own voice, you want your own style, write music. And he would come see us once every 2 weeks, and we would have to have a piece ready for him, and we'd play it during the course of that week and next.
Well, one of the great things about the New England Conservatory, where the program was at the time, is all of the faculty are responsible to give a concert one night each year, and it's free to the public. and Ron Carter played a solo bass
Oh, I
concert.
still remember that.
And I remember him saying, now on this piece, I'm going to use all the techniques that I never use in a recording studio, because if you can't see them, they're lost. And it's like, here's all the flash, folks, in one solo. But it was unbelievable. And I know it was an incredible experience for you. But as someone who went to a professional school after college, I know, and many people have this experience, you kind of learn the subject sometimes without learning what it's like to be in the profession and be a professional. And particularly for someone who at one time may have felt, I'm going to be a soloist with orchestras, or I'm going to be part of a chamber group. Mm-hmm. Being a working jazz musician is a very different thing. Were you prepared?
I had so much to learn, and I think it's maybe good I wasn't prepared, because I had no preconceptions. I was just open, because I had no experience of what it was like to play in a club or play in a jam session, or how to, put a set together. And that's crazy now that I think about it. So that was one of the great things about being in Boston, because it's so concentrated, and Wally's was right around the corner. And they had a dedicated room for the Monk Institute, and so I would just try and do as much playing as possible, because I knew I was still playing catch-up. And it wasn't until I stayed in Boston one more year after I graduated, before I moved to New York, trying to get a handle on just how do you put a set list together. I remember things that Ron Carter said to us, or different teachers would come back to me while I'd be on the band and say, oh, this is what they mean, or, oh, this is, and just the experience of going through it in Boston, which is a little less intimidating than in New York, I think. So I'm very blessed to have that time, although I feel like, I don't know, I tell people, now I feel like I'm treading water in terms of just being a jazz artist. Before, I felt like I was drowning a little bit, because it was just so much, right? I mean, and some things just take time. Another thing I'm forced to admit, you can't rush it, So I'm just so grateful there was room in the music for me, because, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Now, you mentioned your family's expectations of you as a young girl. How did they take this turn in direction?
Well, they weren't thrilled with the whole classical music thing, but at least they had some experience of that and some frame of reference. So when I told them, all of a sudden, they must have thought I was crazy, because my dad hit the roof. What? What? So I think, it all came from a good place, although I am a little sad, although I do appreciate what they went through to give me a life where I could study music, when I think about where they came from. So I try to remember that, because they were just trying to survive. So music they were never able to develop an appreciation for music, because it was just never able to have the time for it in their lives. So I think they're just happy that I'm happy doing what I'm doing, and that I'm not homeless.
Now, when a musician moves to New York, there are a variety of hurdles you have to encounter. And one is just to get yourself established to do your own music. How long did it take you to present your own music, your own conceptions?
Well, when I moved to New York, nobody really knew who I was. I just knew the masters that I had studied with and some musicians. So I don't know. Do I ever feel established? I think it took I moved in 99, and I think I did my first gig. But these are small little things. I would say a good at least 5 years to feel like confident, like this is something I'm have enough confidence in to present, versus just trying it out in a small venue.
And what was keeping you going in those 5 years? Particular gigs you had, or just the opportunity to work on your music when you weren't?
Well, I always
gigging?
tell younger musicians who ask, well, what advice? I'm thinking about moving to New York, and I always tell them, try and find some sort of living situation or some sort of financial situation that you've saved up money where you don't have to worry about that for a while. Because if you're so consumed with that New York is a tough place to live, so then you don't have any time to develop your craft. So I was so blessed and fortunate to find, a relatively low rent, but in a nice neighborhood to live. And thinking back, I'm just filled with so much appreciation because, I didn't have a piano. And I remember thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I said, well, let me just rent one. And I never thought I would rent one from Steinway because they're the most expensive piano. But I went in, and the guy who was in charge of rentals at that time just happened to be a pianist too. And he went to Berkeley. And when he heard me play, he said, oh, you actually play. So he gave me a break, So, that was so, for little things like that make such a huge difference. I was able to practice where I live. And I did little gigs here and there. And lived very carefully. Let's put it that way.
Now, just looking at your recording history and the gigs you've got on your website and what have you, one alternative for a pianist that other musicians may not have is accompanying singers. And I see it's something you still do, and you seem to have some, relationship with 3 or 4 people you work with. And I wonder if you'd talk about that, because I think that we often feel like, oh, if you're a serious player who's got their own band and writing their own tunes, that's really like working weddings and bar mitzvahs or something. But it really isn't, is it?
See, I never thought that. I had always wanted, my dream was, I just want the chair, sideman chair in an established band. And I did some of that. I was fortunate to, and continue to do some of that, but not enough. So I actually became a leader out of necessity more than because I thought, well, this is the way to go, or this means I made it, or anything like that. And I love playing for singers because I think that really shows me where I really am. Because I think in a band you can hide a lot of things. You can not deal with certain things, like knowing songs in different keys, being able to transpose quickly, being able to accompany someone, which, you were talking about the classical world, jazz world, because a classical pianist is a very solitary experience in some ways, because you're in the practice room by yourself. And you might play with orchestra, you might play with chamber music is a little different, but mainly it's all on you. It's all on you on stage. But in a jazz group, it's not. And that's something I continually have to remember and remind myself, because it's more about where can we find a meeting place today on the stage and make some music versus it has to go like this and this and this, and that means that was a good performance. And I'll always remember something Kenny Barron said. He said, with classical music, you don't step on the stage until you've perfected it in the practice room. But with jazz, you perfect it on the stage. So, I love playing with singers. It's such a great experience. And I love playing as a sideman too. And I like being a band leader, but I get sick of myself. So I want to play. I'm tired of myself. I want to play other people's music. And it's just great because I've gotten so many ideas from hearing other people's music, or a motif or something that inspires me. So it's like a really nice cycle.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that not just the people who are in the band tonight, but there's kind of a community of musicians you've established a long relationship with. But at the same time, the gigs for your quartet are by no means the focal point of what you're doing in the course of a year. How do you maintain the concept of your band in these situations? Talk about how it happens, because, from the recorded evidence, you've done it very well, but it's not like you're on the road for months and months perfecting the music.
Yeah, that's the dream, right? To have a consistent band, and it's so different now, and I think it's something our generation has to deal with, because when I remember Ron Carter telling me they would play 6-7 nights a week, 3-4 sets a night, weeks on end. And I forgot one of those, what is it, Malcolm
Gladwell.
Gladwell. That tipping point, is that the where
right.
The sheer volume of playing, you need it, So I had to find mine in a piecemeal kind of way. And I think that was a good training ground, because, I don't have work. Sometimes I have work for an extended period of time, and you can have the same musicians, but that ends, and the chances of that same band being around for the next gig are almost nil, So having been trained in that kind of, jumping from one thing to the next, I think made me flexible and made me realize. I think the key is remembering what happened at the gig and where you want to go next. And I think musicians today, they're used to, it's so funny, they're more used to coming in and they need to deliver that night. They don't have the luxury of a week to get comfortable. So I think the fact that we are all kind of working in that environment helps things work that way. It can work. So I think the combination of those circumstances have helped me continue a train of thought.
Okay. When we exchanged emails before the session, and you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing you, that you feel like your classical background and your jazz background are suddenly merging at a place where you haven't had them before. And that was kind of striking to me because the two CDs that come to my mind, the Songbird for Albany, after Albany's, and then Going Express, one, very clearly you're drawing on a classical composer, but the other, even in your originals, you can hear that there is a blending going on. And I'm curious about how you see the evolution and how it has taken place for you.
Well, when I was playing jazz, or learning to play jazz, the important thing was how can I play lines that were in the vocabulary, sounded good, and that were swinging, and then how do you do with this left hand? So I found myself playing single lines with my right hand and these comping chords in my left hand 90% of the time. And then I think, man, I used to play concertos where I covered the whole keyboard and chords and all this stuff, and now I feel like I'm stuck in this. And not that was bad, but I felt like, gosh, I feel like there's a whole piece of me that's on hold. But that's part of I think the whole catching up, because I didn't want to just be a classical pianist who could get by because I had the chops, I loved the music too much for that, So now I feel like now I'm treading water, I can start bringing that into the music more consciously, and because I'm not so consumed with just trying to sound authentic, and then there's also the pressures of, different teachers, all well-meaning, you need to be more this, you need to wish, and you want to be all those things, but at the same time, it's like eventually I felt like I have to be comfortable with where I am and who I am and what I love about this music, and I hope that makes sense.
No, I'm someone who has come to classical music late after listening to jazz all my life, and I find that I'll be listening to certain classical and say, oh, that's sort of like this jazz person. Do you hear any jazz, and does it put you in mind of your earlier repertoire?
Well, the one interesting thing is when I play classical music, I feel like, oh, I see what that composer is doing. He really just wants to improvise there, and that's why he wrote the line like that. And, if I played it now, I would improvise because I feel like that's where the piece is going, but he just wrote it out, And another thing is, I used to play a lot of music by J.S. Bach, his preludes and fugues, and I used to be able to memorize the fugues just like that. But now, I think my conception of music is now vertical because you focus so much on the harmonies and improvisation, and I was having trouble memorizing these fugues, which are all lines, right? Linear, horizontal. I could fake something because I remember the chords, but but I couldn't. So it's changed, but mostly it's more from a compositional, structural, and just harmonic.
Okay. Now, in a perfect world, all teachers would draw on their experience and offer a singular perspective, and the level of their artistry would validate their perspective. But I wonder, as a teacher now, because you mentioned that you're teaching at Berkeley, who maybe has a different background from the kids who came into school because they started in a high school jazz band and learned the jazz harmony methods and everything, if you have things to impart that you feel are a little different.
I think a lot of the students I see don't actually have that much classical training, and that's one thing I think every student should at least get a fair amount of, because if anything, music is music, right? And it's all important. I think if if a student thinks, well, all I want to do is play jazz, I think he's doing himself or herself a disservice if they don't explore classical music, because there's a lot of, interweaving there too, anyway. And also it teaches you a good approach to the keyboard. If my teacher did have a really good technical concept of just playing in a way where you don't injure yourself, because musicians, we're what they call it is micro athletes in a way, because a lot of them I feel don't have solid approaches to the keyboard or solid technique, and that can be a hindrance for the rest of your life if you don't get that together. And I feel even the students who have high school experience playing jazz, a lot of them still lack just basic vocabulary. And I think that was good for me that I learned it so much later, so actually I could verbalize, and explain it in a way, versus like sight reading is something that comes easily to me, that always has, but I can't really tell people how to be better at it. So I think in terms of technique and just how do you put together a jazz conception, comping, sense of swing, I feel like I like to do visual things, and I don't want to say square. When they say square, it has a negative connotation, but I don't mean it that way at all. I tell them that the classical beat is mainly subdivided by 2. So if I had to represent it by a picture, I'd have like in a 4/4 bar, it'd be 4 squares in a row. Jazz is divided by 3, and the beat is rounder, so I would say 4 balls in a row. And I remember when I first was listening to Ellington, somebody told me to check out Danilo Perez. He was one of my teachers at New England Conservatory. I realized my listening ended before the jazz beat ended, so I only heard the cymbal going ting, 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 but ting, 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 ting. I didn't hear that at first, so maybe in those things, I think.
Well, now I wonder when you confronted, because you're talking about proper technique, and you obviously know Thelonious Monk's music well, and I think of people like Monk or Horace Silver, whose technique would send most classical piano teachers leaping out windows,
But I've seen videos of Monk playing, and he does not have bad technique.
Well, I think he's an example of someone who may have just used what he needed rather than what he was capable of using. But more generally than the specific of Monk, when you do come into the jazz world, you find things that would be technically challenged by some people, but have expressive value. And I wondered if that was something you could embrace quickly, or that was a stumbling block early on.
Well, I have to admit, when I first heard Monk for the first time, I was like, oh my God, what's he doing? But it was, and that's something that's so brilliant about him. He never sounded like anybody but himself. And I think the whole technique thing is a little bit, this is my personal opinion, is a little bit of a misnomer. I think, yes, you can do things that are, basically, I think jazz pianists, they have a tendency, if anything, to bang a little bit, right? To be a little, But I think if you look a little closer, all of them had really good technique. And, the music calls for that. Like somebody said to me, the piano has to growl sometimes, So I think, personally, what classical teachers have issue with is just the banging and the maybe harsh sound, but that's part of the aesthetics, part of the music, part of the rawness, part of the life of the music.
And one final thing I want to ask, and then I want to let everyone else have their opportunity. One big difference from the classical world to the jazz world is playing with a rhythm section and relating to a drummer and a bass player. And I wonder if you have any insights to share on that part of the journey.
Oh, it's done wonders for my perfectionism and control issues. Because, we all hear and feel and listen to music a little differently. And trying to find that common ground, it's been such a good learning experience. And, I think for whatever reasons, just being in jazz music, jazz has made me hopefully the best version of who I am. And that when I said earlier how it's not up to me, it's not all about how I think it should go one night, and letting your guard down, learning how to listen and play at the same time, which is not easy at all, and trusting, that's a huge thing. So that to me, that I enjoy so much, the rhythm section. To me, that's the heart and soul of the music going on.
Okay. Let me open this up to others. I'm sure there must be. Yep.
I think hindsight is always 20/20, right? And tastes change. I think personally, if you're honest and if what you're doing is sincere and really what you feel, because I do believe those artists felt that they were doing what they felt. But personally, I never want to forget the audience. I want them to have a good time. It's not just a matter. I'm not saying those musicians that you named did that, but it's not just a matter of us having a good time. Oh, how cool we are. Oh, did you hear that? And, I want the audience to come along for the ride with us, to enjoy, because we're putting on a show, and entertainment is not a bad word, I hope jazz never becomes a museum piece, I don't want I feel like it's still relevant, it's still now, and I think not forgetting the audience is an important part of that.
Others? We all going to go to dinner early today? Really? Okay.
You did too good of a job.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah. I'd actually forgotten I asked for one, but I'm so glad they didn't. I have a new record coming out in September, and I play Fender Rhodes on that. So I'll be doing some things on the Fender Rhodes. And, I've done that in the past, playing with the bassist Lonnie Plaxico, and more recently with Terry Lynn Carrington's Mosaic Project. So I love the Fender Rhodes. So.
Yep.
When I first started listening to jazz, I was a young teenager, and the first band was Stan Kenton in particular.
Wow.
And in today's world, maybe I'm just not listening or in the right places, but the big band doesn't have the prominence that it did in the 30s and 40s and 50s. What do you have to say about that? And have you played with big bands?
Yes, I've been so fortunate. I played in Clark Terry's big band, and also I'm doing more and more stuff with the Mingus big band. I think part of the reason is just purely economics. It's expensive to have a big band in a club and put them on the road. I think the legacy bands are still going strong, I think. But that's what I mean. Like, I don't know. Even though their legacy, I think people still enjoy it. It's a nostalgia thing. I love the Mingus Big Band. To me, that's one of the most fun bands to play with, because there's this rawness, this anything goes, wild, crazy that is part of Mingus's persona, and I love that going for broke kind of mentality. So I think there's still, people are trying, and I think it's just harder to present in general. So you're just going to see less of it, unfortunately. Fantastic.
But you know what Helen was talking about, the difficulties of just keeping a
logistics.
quartet together.
Oh.
It's kind of exponential when you think about a 15-piece
16
band,
piece,
16-piece band, what have you. The Mingus Big Band is great, and I haven't seen them in New York in a while, but, I mean, you must be one of more than one pianist.
Yeah.
And I used to laugh when I go to see them. This is way back in the
At the
time
Fez?
Time
Time
Cafe,
Cafe,
day,
oh.
which is before the Fez, I guess. But, Sue Mingus would sit at a table in the back, and at the end of the night, the baritone player would turn the parts in, and then the baritone player who was playing next week would come from their gig and pick them up. And It was like, somebody at a train station with a timetable kind of working this all out. It still
Yeah.
probably works that way,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm familiar with you as a musician, but I'm not really familiar with you as a musical, and I was just wondering, in this world of the media and more artists sort of making their own careers as a young musician, whatever, what your relationship is to record labels and doing your own thing, and I'm just not familiar, so I'm just interested in
I think it's interesting how we've lived in a time where stuff has changed so drastically in such a short amount of time. Before only, the record labels were the gatekeepers in a ways, but now anybody can make their own records. And I've been fortunate. I've licensed most of my albums. Well, actually, licensed. I have 5 as a leader so far, and 4 of them are licensed to 2 different labels, and one was done by Steeplechase. It was first as Fresh Sound, then Sunnyside, Steeplechase, and I'm kind of excited. The next one in September will be my first major label release. So I believe, who knows things are changing so quickly. I think it's hard because that means there's so much more out there. Just the sheer volume of material is daunting, and I think it makes it even more difficult for the artist. How can you make sure you're heard? But I always say that's our time, and we have to find a way to deal with it. We have to really be smart. I think musicians now, they have to do so many different things, and if that means our development as artists takes a little longer, then that's just how it has to be. Because there's you can't compare playing every night, 7 nights a week, to what we do now. But I said, we'll all get to where we get to when we get there.
Now, the 2 albums I mentioned earlier were both on Sunnyside,
Yes.
I think. And that's one of my favorite labels, but it's basically a label where the artist produces and maybe licenses.
Yes.
So it's just a label operated by someone with excellent taste who chooses music that in the way artists want to present themselves. Do you find it's different dealing with a major label in terms of...
Yes.
Do you care to divulge how?
Well, I think more is at stake. They have a lot more say in terms of what you can put on the record, or what you put on the record, and that can be good and bad. Because for me, so far, I think it's been positive because their A&R guy actually came up with the order of the pieces, and he really did a good job. I said, wow, I would have never thought to do that. And he was like, yeah, I'm known for that. So that's so that's good, and also I feel more pressure because you want to sell a lot of records, so please tell 100 of your closest friends in September. No, I'm just kidding. I think it's just more pressure because it's more at stake, more visibility, but that's okay. That's what I want. So.
Okay. Anyone else in the back?
Yeah, Terry Lynn is something else. I have such high respect for her. She, is a consummate musician, but also a band leader, producer, just a visionary. And it's so funny. I remember NPR interviewed us while we were making the record in the studio, and they kept saying, we're not going to talk about how this is an all-female thing. And we're not, but that's all we talked about anyway. I think it's just unavoidable. You can't not talk about it. But I think it's wonderful that so many women are playing jazz at such a high level. Because she kept saying people had been telling her for the longest time, when are you going to do that? When are you going to do that? She's like, well, I'm not going to do that until the musicians I want, for my sound, if they're women, I don't want it to be because they're women, but if they happen to be women. And I think she felt things had reached that point where she could. So it was really inspiring because she's had so much experience doing so many different things. And I feel very lucky to be a part of that. And so we toured a lot last year in support of that, and we're going to do some more this year. So.
I want to ask you about one piece on that album. Is it more or less the title piece, the Mosaic Trilogy? There are many great musicians on the album, some of whom play the same instrument. And there are 3 different keyboard players.
Yeah.
In addition to Helen, there's Jerry Allen and Patrice Rushin. And this piece, Mosaic Trilogy, basically you're all 3 playing on it.
Well, I had 3 parts. Jerry played the first part, I played the second part, and Patrice played the third.
And was it all done?
No, not at the same time. Jerry and I were in New York, but Patrice was later since she lives in California.
But there are a lot of vocals on the album. Yes. This is an instrumental piece, and it's amazing the way Terry kind of conceived it. And you actually hear 3 distinct personalities. And needless to say, everybody holds their own, you know.
Yeah, it's quite amazing how she put, Dee Dee Bridgewater, Cassandra Wilson, Diane Reeves, Esperanza Spalding, and Angela Davis did a spoken word. So.
And a very good alto player who I was
Tina
unfamiliar.
Kapostma.
Yeah.
She met Terry during the Sisters in Jazz program.
And I think Ingrid Jensen and
Ingrid Jensen plays
Cohen.
trumpet,
Yeah,
and
it's quite a cast.
Yeah.
Quite a cast. Any other? Yep.
I saw you play at the bakery years ago.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Someone who studied violin. Was that a challenge?
Oh, it was so much fun. I remember I actually couldn't stand the sound of violin playing jazz because it felt like so with the vibrato until I heard Regina playing with Kenny Barron. I was like, wow, that I like that. And I was so tickled when she asked me to tour with her back then. And no, it was so much fun. It was like, reminded me of my violin days. I wanted to pull out my violin, and actually Regina plays on this new CD that's coming out in September. She plays a couple of tracks. So I felt like it's full circle in some ways.
Oh. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, okay. The question was, does Helen prefer any particular grand piano and why?
I prefer Steinway because, there are other fabulous instruments too, Fazioli, Yamaha, Baldwin, but I like Steinway because each piano is so different, and the piano can, a good Steinway, of course. The piano can be so beautiful and sensitive and tender, but it can also growl. Like, the American Steinways have that brashness to them that I think is needed in jazz.
Is there any particular club or concert hall that has a piano you look forward to playing?
Yes, the Jazz Standard has one of the best pianos. Dizzy's, the Vanguard. I'd like to try Carnegie Halls one day.
Okay. But now, and Going Express was recorded at the Jazz Standard.
Yes, at the
right?
Jazz Standard. And I'm spoiled because I play there. The Mingus Band plays there every Monday, so I get to play that piano on a regular basis.
Okay. Okay. Well, good. I think I'm trying to rein these sessions in a bit because the concerts are starting at 8 o'clock this year.
Yeah.
I want to make sure the artist has time to compose themselves. But as you see, Helen is pretty well together already. And as I say, this is one of the evenings I've really been looking forward to. So thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
And thank you in advance
Thank
for
you
what
for
we're going to do later.
coming.
And tomorrow's my day off, so we're not yours. Ileana Elias and her trio, I guess, are going to be up in the theater tomorrow evening. The last 2 sessions I'm going to do, we usually do them with the artists the day of the show, but since there are 2 shows on Sunday and 2 people we wanted to talk to, Pancho Sanchez has agreed to come up early, and we're going to be speaking with Pancho at 5:30 Saturday, and then at 4 o'clock on Sunday, we're going to be talking to Greg Tardy. So, and they're both playing on Sunday, Gretchen Parlato on Saturday, and I'm sure I'm going to see everybody a few more times, but thanks for coming out, and see you again.
Thank you.